how is business used for balance sheet is used for strategy formulation by the businesses. So remember, balance sheet has an objective, P&L has an objective, cash flow statement also has an objective. And what is the objective? The objective of all of them put together, P&L has an objective to let the readers of the P&L know as to how is the financial performance of this entity. The balance sheet has the purpose to let the people know as to how is the financial position of this company. And the cash flow statement has the objective to let the readers know as to how is the liquidity or how is the cash generating capacity or ability of this entity. So balance sheet is also used for the purpose of strategy formulation. And how is the balance sheet used for the purpose of strategy formulation? For that, first of all, we need to understand as to how is my balance sheet. So if my balance sheet reserves and surplus is weak, if my balance sheet debt equity ratio is very high, in my balance sheet the current ratio also very high, extraordinarily high, then I would say that this balance sheet needs correction. And how do we effect those corrections? Let's understand. So if the balance sheet is not in a good shape, that means there are no reserves and surpluses. The debt equity ratio is very high. Current ratio is also extremely high, and that means this balance sheet or this entity needs correction. So what corrections would you do? Number one is the management has to consciously start deploying more profit. So instead of paying the profit as dividend to the shareholders, the major part of it, the management or the promoters will need to decide to redeploy the profits, right? So when you redeploy the profit, your reserves and surplus figure goes up. And remember, it's not the reserves and surplus figure which is important. It is the money which is deployed into the business, the profits which are deployed into the business, that is more important, and that is what that will let you know. Efficient management of working capital, lowering of current ratio. Please remember, gone are the days when people would think that the current ratio must be as high as 2 is to 1. Now that is completely theory. It is only in the books on the financial management that you can read that the current ratio must be 2 is to 1 or must be 2. Not a good sign at all. The current ratio lower the better. And I have already explained to you why the lower current ratio is better, because lower the current ratio, so long as your business is making profit, so long as you are paying to your suppliers, your employees, your service providers, your government taxes, your lenders, so long as you are paying to every one of them on time, right, and you are making profit, then by choice and by design you must keep your current ratio as low as possible, because lower you make your current ratio, more cash becomes free from the working capital, which you can use for efficiently managing your operations. Number three thing that you can do for improving the balance sheet is align your debt equity ratio to EBITDA level. Now please remember, I mentioned yesterday and I mentioned today also, debt equity ratio uh, should not be looked at in isolation. Debt equity ratio must always be looked at in conjunction with your EBITDA level. Meaning what? Meaning, if the EBITDA of your business is very handsome, very good, large, in that case, and if the economy is in a good shape and the industry that you are in has got huge potential, in a case like this, leveraging your EBITDA, you can afford to borrow more, because when you borrow more, you can flare growth of your business by borrowing, and therefore you need to realign your debt equity ratio with the EBITDA. If your EBITDA is weak, you got to ensure that your debt equity ratio is as low as possible. If your EBITDA is strong, then you can afford to have a very high debt equity ratio. Why? Because since your EBITDA is very good, any amount of debt that you would take, you would be able to service it. Because ultimately, when you borrow, you have to service it. Meaning what? Meaning you have to pay interest on it. You have to repay that loan. How will you repay the loan? How will you service the debt? How will you pay the interest? So you will pay the interest from the EBITDA. So अगर आपका EBITDA, if your EBITDA is very good, you can of course borrow high. But if your EBITDA is weak, then you ensure that your debt equity ratio is as low as possible. As a matter of fact, in that case, what you can do is dispose of non-operating idle assets. So if your EBITDA is low and your debt equity ratio is high, that means you are in a dangerous zone. And why you are in a dangerous zone? Because since your EBITDA is high, if it takes further dip, you may not have enough cash in your hand to pay your lenders and to repay the loan. And that means what? That means your lenders can take you to the NCLT through the IBC 2016. And in that case, what can happen? The company can be taken away from you and can be given to somebody else. As we all know, there are so many examples. So, how do you face a situation like this? So, if your company is having some idle asset and which is lying unused, so this is a non-operative idle asset lying somewhere, dispose it off. Dispose it off. Remember, you are in business not for a day, you are in a business for continuity. And therefore, what is important is long-term sustainability. What is important is not today but also tomorrow. So therefore, if your debt equity ratio is high and your EBITDA is low, do one thing: sale of your ideal assets, non-operating assets, get cash, use that cash for repaying the debt, bring your debt equity ratio down. So when you bring your debt equity ratio down, as a result of that, what happens? As a result of that, your EBITDA, which is weak, is able to sustain the lower debt servicing obligations. So this is, and then of course, finally, for improving your balance sheet, what you also need to do is operating leverage. Meaning what? You have a high fixed cost in the form of interest or other fixed cost. So what you can do, check as to how can you increase your volumes. Remember, and just pay attention, in business we have two kinds of cost: fixed cost and the variable cost. Fixed cost, up to a point, it is there. After a point, if we increase the volume, the fixed cost is incurred and it does not increases, but the variable cost keeps increasing as we produce more. So in your business, if you have fixed costs that you have already incurred, now if you increase your volumes, if you increase the quantity that you produce, now what is going to happen is this fixed cost that you have already incurred will get distributed over increased volume, and thereby your per unit total cost will come down. Your variable cost will not change, it will still be the same. Your fixed cost in totality will still be the same, but your fixed cost in terms of per unit will come down. Why? Because the fixed cost is now getting a portion on a larger base of output, and thereby your total cost per unit will come down, and that will lead to increased profitability, increased per unit profitability also. As a result of that, the entity will have more cash available to them which they can deploy, and thereby they can increase their reserves and surplus figure by deploying. So friends, this is how you can use these strategies, you can use for improving your balance sheet. Again, Shivam, we can take two questions.